Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second session of Healing Through Grief. And welcome all. It's wonderful to see you. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from. And I would like to invite us all to just take a moment to fully arrive to our session, to connect with the present moment, with the breath. So if you are able to get comfortable on your seat, wherever you're seated, and if you're comfortable to close your eyes, or at least soften your gaze. Isalia de Puerto Rico, bienvenida. So just sit back and just take a moment to settle into yourself. Connect with your breath, connect with your heart. Allowing everything to slow down so you can fully arrive. And taking a moment to imagine how we are all connected from the different parts of the world where we are tuning in from, whether we are live or watching the recording. We create a web of connection that covers our earth with this beautiful intention of learning more about healing through grief. So we can imagine whatever that is for you, but to me, it just feels like this very loving embrace that we can share with the world, those of us who are here and called to this work. And that together, that intention to support healing through grief is stronger. And I'm very grateful for that. So taking a few more deep breaths in and long, slow exhales. We take our time to return to our space together, to our learning together, to our sharing together. And today, I want to introduce ISABEL STENZEL BYRNES, and I apologize if I'm not saying that correctly. And she is an amazing person. We will get to find out a lot about her life and her work, and we're very excited and honored to have you. Thank you for being with us. And she is a hospice social worker. She is a bereavement therapist, and she's a writer and a speaker. And I am very much looking forward to this presentation about storytelling. So we are with a master storyteller. And with that, I'll pass it right on to you so that we can get started.
Thank you so much, Wilka. It is such an honor to be here. I have admired you, Wilka, and Ken and the whole organization. I think since the beginning of these sessions, I have participated. So I'm grateful to be here to meet all of you from around the world, and honored to share my story with you. I did recently have eye surgery. That's why I have a little eye cover here. It looks a little bit different, but that's just part of my story. So I'd like to share my screen. I'm sitting in my home in Redwood City, California, and I work at Mission Hospice, which is a small nonprofit hospice in San Mateo near San Francisco, California. So I would like to share my screen here today let's see if it pops up. Takes some time. There we go. Today I will be talking about the art of storytelling through grief. And Wilka, you introduced me as a storyteller, and certainly I am, but I also am a conduit for storytelling. I invite people to tell their stories, and I listen and I share them and they share theirs. So that's really what I'm going to be talking about. So let's see, I want to start with an opening reading because this is what we are doing. We're listening to the written word and the stories we hear from each other and also from the work that I do in writing through loss. So this is from a friend of mine, Marianne O'Hare, an author of Little Matches, a memoir of grief and light about the death of her daughter. She writes that she existed and then she did not, and everything fell away. And I was left with the fact of me still existing inside a world that had to make sense if I were to continue living in it. Writing was the only thing that helped. And so we're going to take a deep dive into what that means for Marianne and for so many others. And of course, I want to thank Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross for her prolific writing that brought us all together and continues to inspire and continue her legacy. And thank you to Ken Ross as well for being here and leading the way. So the power of story, we all know how powerful it is. That's the work that we do. All suffering is bearable if it is seen as part of a story. And so we know that for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, we as human beings have naturally gathered to hear each other's stories, to sit around and listen and connect through storytelling. So it is part of our biology, it is our instinct, and I believe it's a need that we have intrinsically to listen to each other's stories. So why do stories matter? Stories make sense of life. They put together the pieces so that it makes a coherent picture of our lives. Stories help us regain control of our lives. I tell all of my clients that we do not have a choice or we don't have control over what happens in our stories or how our stories end, but we do have plenty of control on how to tell our stories. Stories shape our lives. We're informed, inspired, influenced by the stories we hear. And sharing stories gives us back our voice. And I'll talk more about that later. Sharing stories builds community. So I have been very inspired in these sessions with the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation talks, when the speakers share a little bit about their personal stories. And I feel I'm going to ask you to listen to mine, and I hope you get something out of it like I get something out of all of the other speakers. So these are my parents on the upper corner. My mother is an immigrant from Japan. My father from Germany, but I was born and raised in the United States. So I come from a very international family, and that's perhaps why I'm so drawn to this group, speaking to people from all around the world. And my parents were born in the beginning of World War II. And so their lives, as you can imagine, in Japan and Germany, even though politically, yes, their countries were the cause of World War II, they, as people and as families, suffered tremendously. So loss was part of their lives since they started. My grandfathers were recruited to the war. My grandfather from Japan never came home. And my grandfather from Germany came home 8 years later after prisoner of war camp. And both my grandparents, German and Japanese, lost a child. So this is part of their lives. And for them, and I think my grandparents, it was all about survival, finding food, finding a safety. And so grief was set aside, and grief became, emotional impact of grief became something that they had to not focus on, but rather focus on moving forward, finding their lives, finding normalcy and structure, such as attending school, which didn't come until later, until their lives were settled. They were both refugees from their original land. So that's a little bit about where I come from. And the emotional inheritance would be stoicism. Both of my parents are quite stoic in their emotions and don't really express them. Although my mother became very Americanized over the years and became a social worker. So that's a little bit about my parents' history, and I'd like to share my story with writing. So both my twin sister and I were born with a very serious genetic disease called cystic fibrosis. And so we spent many years in and out of the hospital as children. This was our normal life, and we did not know anything else. And when I was about 9 years old or 10 years old, my mother visited the hospital and gave us a book, a journal, and said, "Here, I want you to write about your feelings in the hospital." So that was her first way of saying, I know this is hard. And she couldn't say the words, but she could show me that she wanted us, my sister and I, to express what was going on. So these are just little samples of our childhood writing. Most of them were complaints about the nurses and the food and the roommates we hated. So a little bit of catharsis there. And it wasn't until we were teenagers that my sister and I started to write more about our illness, but mostly about what we learned about medicine and what we learned about the hospital. And we wrote a booklet called Life at Kaiser. Kaiser is a hospital system in the United States. And we showed how to do an IV, what kind of procedures we had. And this was a way for us now, as an adult, I can see it was a way to gain mastery, to show that we were in control of some of these medical procedures that were really out of our control. And it was really the first step as I was growing up to feel the power of writing and what it was doing for me in my coping with this illness. And my illness continued. It's a lung disease and continued to have constant infections. Very difficult to go in and out of the hospital and learn that this was my life, so different from others. And pardon the sort of explicitness of this photo, but I continued to have opportunities to write and express myself. This was when I was a young adult. My friend started a photography project, and she asked me and my sister to take a picture of something that expressed our illness experience. And so this was how I felt, like I was soaking in a bathtub. And she also invited me to write a poem. And so these kind of opportunities came up regularly, and I continued to write creatively and express myself in all sorts of artistic ways. I'm not going to talk about the art because we have plenty of wonderful professionals who will be speaking about the way we can express ourselves in art. But I wanted to share this, this image and photograph as an example of early writing assignments that I did growing up. And this is a picture of me when I was very sick. I had end-stage lung disease. And this is when I started to write my book. As you can see, I had many medical machines with me, but I had my computer. And so we can write whether we're healthy or sick, whether we're weak or strong, and whether we're young or elder. So I was 30 when I started to write my memoir. knowing that I was at the end of my life and that I wanted to document the life that I had lived, I decided to write a twin memoir with my sister. So each of us wrote a chapter. There was a lot of arguing and bickering, just like sisters do, but together we created a beautiful project. So when I was 32, I reached the end of my natural life, and I went through the dying process. I went through end-stage lung disease that was very difficult. I actually felt like I had left this world. I coded, which means I stopped breathing. I saw the light. I saw people who had died in front of me. It was a very powerful spiritual experience. I could spend an hour talking about it. But then I woke up 3 days later. I woke up because of this young man. This young man is Javier Jesus Cervantes, who is a Mexican-American 18-year-old, and he died in a car accident, and his lungs became my lungs. So organ donation is the reason that I'm here. Our stories intersected. His story ended with me, but his story physically continues because I'm breathing with his lungs. So I just wanted to share this story to appreciate Xavier, and his story continues as I tell it to you all. Even though I have never met him, I have met his family. I grieve him every single day because of his gift of life. So after my transplant and my sister was blessed with a transplant, we both decided to continue to write. And we created a memoir, which was published. The first draft of our story was almost 500 pages, full of anger and chaos and lots of difficult stories and emotions. And that process, editing it down, focusing on what was most important, clarifying what the story we wanted to tell, really was the transformative gift of this writing experience. We grew lighter, we grew happier, and also the power of writing about people we had lost really helped us memorialize them and move us through our own grief. And this book was also translated into Japanese, as well as made into a documentary film. So we've been incredibly blessed with our writing journal. And sadly, my twin sister passed away. She died 8 years ago, Anna. She developed cancer after 2 transplants. But what she did write in the second edition of the book that came out just shortly after she died, she wrote, "By living alongside death for so long, I have truly lived. By being aware of limited time, I have not wasted any time, and my life has been better for it. There are no regrets." So that piece of writing, as you can imagine, in my grief, was a lifesaver, to know that her grief, her life had been complete, that had been full, and that she had so much gratitude, even if it ended at 41 years. So again, I think the gift of writing, like with Elisabeth Kübler-Ross and so many other authors, is that we get to continue learning from them even way after their death. So that's my story to share, and thank you for listening. One of my group members gave me permission to share. She's an artist, songwriter, and poet, and she wrote, "All that I have seen and all that I have known has contributed to a story perfectly and uniquely mine." So that is my story. Now I want to dive into more material about writing And I welcome questions towards the end, but I'm going to kind of dive in deep here. Why do we write? So there are many reasons that we write, of course. It's easy. Well, for some of us, it's easy. It's easy in the sense that we have just a notebook. That's all we need. It's cheap. It's personal. Only we can do it individually. It doesn't take that much time. And I'll talk more about what I mean by that later. It's portable. I always keep a little booklet. And now, of course, in the iPhone, we have the notes. So we can put in our writing into the little notes pages. It can stay private, or we can share it. There's something very sacred about our own private writing that we know we have expressed, but we then don't want to share it. Even somebody like Anne Frank, who wrote for herself and only herself, eventually that private writing became a masterpiece of sharing with the world to help us understand her experience. And of course, it takes no innate talent. Some people say, oh, I can't write, I'm not good at writing. And maybe that's because of their high school teacher, but really the truth is we all have a story to share and have a gift of telling it the way we want to tell it. So, pardon me, I have to move this thing so I can read the title. Okay, grief comes in many forms. I'm sorry, writing comes in many forms. Journaling, of course, poetry, including spoken word, which is an almost performance of poetry, lyrics, essays, short story, memoir, fiction. We know all the ways that writing appears. One of my clients was a screenwriter in Los Angeles and incorporated her grief experience into screenwriting. Emails, blogs. In the United States, we have Caring Bridge, which is how we tell stories of usually illness or some difficult experience. Social media posts. So many people say, oh, I don't write, I'm not good at writing. But if you have written an email or if you have written social media posts, you have put words together to share and make sense for other people. And what does writing offer us? My goodness, I could spend an hour on this slide alone. Writing offers so much. It offers reflection, just time out to go inward, to go inside and say, how am I feeling? What is going on for me? Contemplation, almost a practice of externalizing our meditation inside. It helps us gain perspective. We write about how hard our lives are, and then we know other people have harder lives. Or maybe other people have easier lives when we really validate, wow, this is a hard story. We've gained self-awareness, insight into behavior, catharsis. Sigmund Freud used that word to express and get out the emotions. The narrative therapists use the word externalization. We externalize our emotions. I imagine many of you perhaps have experienced what it's like to be upset and then write about it and then feel that, that letting go of tension through externalizing the emotions. Writing helps us understand other people's struggles. When we write about ourselves, but then how other people are dealing with things as well. Writing gives us, of course, sense of growth when we look back and see how far we've come. Emotional expression, we get to say what feelings we have and what they're doing for us and doing to us. Helps us organize our thoughts and feelings. Excuse me. Writing offers life review and legacy work, which is interesting because both of my parents, in-laws as well, are writing. And so perhaps it's a developmental experience of, needing to write towards the later years of life. Writing offers problem solving. When we write down all the problems we have and what we can do about it, it clarifies the path for us. It also helps us make decisions too. And then finally, writing can offer closure. That word is loaded, but closure is what I mean by that is when we have difficulty with a relationship, being able to write the letter to a loved one, having some unfinished business to deal with can really offer some kind of therapeutic benefit. And this is a slide from Dr. Audrey Schaeffer at Stanford. And this kind of sums it up, in my opinion, why writing is so helpful. Writing involves connecting two sides of the brain, the left side, which is logical and rational, as well as the right side, which is creative and emotional. And linking those two together, I think, is probably the magical answer to why writing helps so much. So how does this work? How does writing help? Well, I believe writing gives us a container. It offers containment. So, if we're asked to write in a group or even write a homework assignment, usually it's for a set amount of time. And even, if you're a professional writer like Isabel Allende, she cannot write all day long, morning to night. We have to get up, we have to go to the bathroom, drink some water, eat some food. But that writing process, okay, I'm finished with this paragraph, I'm finished with this chapter, that is holding in the space that we cannot go over in time or in space to tell the story. Writing is also private, is usually private. 99% of the time it's a private act. I say that because I did write with my twin sister. But it does invoke, when we're in our own personal space writing, what I call flow. And perhaps you've heard of that word flow. Flow is when we get completely absorbed into an activity where we lose track of time, where we are so focused, nothing else is noticed. And that's a very healing experience for us as humans. Neuroscience has sort of studied flow and found it to be very helpful for our well-being. Writing takes us to the past. We can feel like we're reliving the past, but it is done in the present. And so it can be a very mindful activity to stay focused here and now. Writing invites confidence. We can reread what we wrote and feel good about it. And other ways, other people can share their comments, and that helps boost our confidence as well. And writing can release feel-good hormones. If we write, and I experienced this as a young person, I wrote in detail about my best friend who died, her laughter, the color of her hair, her body movements, and I could just feel like she was still with me. She was still alive. And even if we write about love, hugging someone, it does induce that feeling of, those hormones, dopamine and oxytocin, pardon me, the love hormone. The name is escaping me right now. Oxytocin, thank you. So that we are able, through our writing, to relive those good feelings. So I have to talk about James Pennebaker. Maybe you've heard of him, but he has been inspirational to me. And I read his book, Opening Up, many, many years ago. And he has spent 30, maybe even 40 years writing about writing. He researches writing and gives assignments. Initially, in his early studies, he gave assignments to college students to write for 20 minutes a day, 4 days in a row, about the most difficult experience they've had in their lives. And he has found in his research that inhibition and suppressing one's thoughts, holding your thoughts and feelings in, is linked to poor health outcomes. And I think sometimes it takes researchers, usually white men, to come up with very obvious findings. And so Maya Angelou, of all people, knows or knew this wisdom before any of the studies. She said, there's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. So according to his research, writing improves health. And he finds that expressive writing can reduce physician visits, improve immune function, reduce stress hormone, and lower depression and anxiety. And the more days that people wrote, the greater the benefit. And like I said, in 40 years, maybe 400 plus studies have been published about writing and the benefits in many different countries, in many different cultures and types of participants. So it's a universal experience as human beings that expressive writing leads to physical health benefits and emotional, but his studies are more focused on physical. So what Dr. Pennebaker found is that there are particular kinds of stories that are especially healing for our bodies. Number one, they have to be narrative. We have to use the word I or tell our own story. Sometimes I get participants in my writing groups who like to write about the beautiful sunset or the flowers in their garden. And that's lovely. But those kind of stories don't actually open up the inner core of our being. They're observations rather than expressive writing. Stories must have a beginning, middle, and end, and they must be coherent. They must flow in a certain way. And the stories must have causal words and insight words. And I have examples of what that means. We have to tell a story and say, it happened because of this, or I discovered the reason was this. There has to be some insight. I went through this hard experience, but now I realize, or now it means that, and show some sort of switch in perspective that especially makes a story healing. And I can give you an example. Sometimes writers will write about, let's give an example about their parent, a mother who died, and write about all the positive, wonderful things about their mother. And that's great. And all the positive feelings they have about their mother, more importantly. But that kind of writing does not always heal. And likewise, somebody else can write about all the terrible feelings they have about their mother, how awful she was, how horrible it was growing up, and all the negative things. And that kind of healing, that kind of writing is not healing. That's called rumination if we only write about the negative. And rumination is not good. It is a way of avoiding sort of deeper issues. And so we need that balance of both positive and negative emotions in whatever context that we're writing about. And we also need a variation in pronouns. Of course, we write about I felt, I thought, I experienced, but we also need to shift and think about other people. How did she or he, or how did they experience this this activity or this life challenge? How did they come to terms with it? And shift again from I to other people and then back to ourselves. There's a whole book that Dr. Pennebaker wrote about pronouns. And of course, we know that the best stories are those that have truth and honesty. That's an absolute requirement for authentic storytelling. So let's shift gears now to writing about grief specifically. And this starts with my inspiration 450 years ago, if I do the math right, William Shakespeare. He wrote in Macbeth, "Give sorrow words. The grief that does not speak knits up the overwrought heart and bids it break." So give sorrow words is a wisdom that we have known for centuries in many different cultures, many different ways. So we know that grievers have a need to tell their stories and tell their stories over and over again, especially in the beginning of a loss. Of course, everyone grieves differently, but sometimes there's a trend that people need to say what happened. If something big happened to you, if you won the lottery today, I imagine you would probably not just tell yourself. You would want to tell someone else. And likewise, if something very difficult happened to us, there's often a need to share it and to tell someone. We need to name and explore and express our chaotic emotions in order to begin to control them. And writing helps us sort of find the dominant stories that we tell ourselves and that we use to explain what happened. But as we continue to write, we might notice that we can explore other narratives. You know, if you write about your son that died of an opiate overdose, there can be a dominant story there. But as we continue to rewrite and tell the story over and over again, their story about their son's illness with addiction can soften or alter into one of suffering rather than one of hatred. It changes. Alette Willis, a storyteller from the UK, calls this restoring oneself. And in grief, Ted Rynearson, who has worked for a long time with people with violent death, calls this restorative retelling, the need to tell the story in different ways. So grief writing is the hero's journey. Perhaps you've heard about Joseph Campbell, that what I try to do is encourage people to see themselves, the mourner, as the protagonist of their story. They almost see themselves inside of a book, and that their beloved person who died is a character, along with other characters, including antagonists in the story. There is a larger plot, and then there's many mini plots, smaller plots. And there are conflicts and climaxes. That's what makes a good story. If we see a movie and there's nothing happening, we might get a little bored. But a good story is one where there is challenge, where there's pain and struggle. And of course, the mourner or the heroine or hero of the story overcomes those challenges in some way and returns from their challenges in a different way. So I see, if people end up writing longer stories and even manuscripts for books, I was informed by Christine Rayner in her book, As Your Life is Story, that we all have a challenge of kind of making a pearl necklace out of our lives, where every pearl is a challenge or difficulty we've had, that we've shaped and held and caressed, so it then does become something beautiful. And we bead the necklace, one bead after another, into with a strand, with a little string. And that string is our life value, our life story, the themes of what we've been through, whether it's belonging or whether it's endurance, perseverance, whether it's love being the enduring theme in our stories of all of these pearls. So stories help us find meaning in grief. Finding meaning, we know, helps mourners adapt to their loss. And Dorothy Allison, a writer, wrote, "I am the only one who can tell the story of my life and say what it means." That is the absolute truth. No one else can tell us what our story means. And finding one's voice is really important in my groups. Today, Elisabeth Kübler-Ross wrote this, today in our shut up, get over it and move on mentality, our society misses so much. And it's no wonder we are a generation that longs to tell our stories. especially grief and tragedy and sorrow and illness, are usually things that kind of end a conversation at a dinner party. We know that. But so many of these grievers that we work with don't have other people to talk to about the true pain that they're experiencing. But when they write it down, it becomes real. It becomes truth. And Linda Hogan, another poet, wrote, as long as pain remains unstoried, as long as the person bearing the pain remains voiceless, the very self is denied. So let's take a little pause. I want to involve and engage you all. Thank you for your listening, but let's do a little, I guess I call it a game, but also some interaction here. I want to invite you in the chat in just a few words to describe grief. I'm going to invite you to engage in a writing activity using your creative minds to describe grief as something you can see, hear, taste, or hold in your hands. So just in a few words, I could say grief is like a tidal wave, or grief is like a cave, a dark cave, something you can see or hear or taste. I'm just going to glance at the chat. Thank you, Lori. A hole in my heart. A sticky ball of tar. Shona, that's a great way to describe it. Francis, grief is like a 100-foot wave of ever crushing over my soul. Yes. Una búsqueda eterna and desmediada. Grief is a wind. Thank you, Rose. A quake, Elisabeth says. Woe is emptiness. Irna, thank you. Joanna, a flood, absolutely a flood. Fogginess, foggy place. I like that description. Waking up on another planet. Adelaide, thank you. Heavy pressing weight. Yes, Christine, I'm thinking of a gym weight almost. Too heavy to move. Atrapada como una spira. Okay. My experience in it. Okay, love comes front. Thank you, Pranab. A cloak. Screaming silence. Silence and storm. Thank you, Michelle. I'm sorry this is difficult for the non-English speakers. I cannot fully translate all of your writing. A black night. A stone with which Sisyphus rolls. Screaming silence. A song that changes tune. Thank you, Katie. Beautifully said. A desert. Dryness, deep dark hole. So I just invite you to notice what it's like to both come up with a description, find the words for this definition of grief, and what is it like for you to read and hear the examples on this chat. Dark hole, what resonates with you? What do you get? Okay, a bitter taste on the tongue. Thank you. I don't know about you, but I find it beautiful to hear these metaphors of grief. And I find it relatable that I can say, yes, grief is a deep, dark hole. It is a weight on my body. Thank you for all of your engagement. Let's see, we've got another one. A deep throbbing pain. Yes. Jennifer, I feel that physical pain of grief when you say that. So just in this small little exercise of words, what I call, this is a game we call word salad, we can understand each other a little deeper because we all get grief and we know how to describe it in very different ways. Beautiful. Thank you. For the sake of time, I'm going to continue moving on, but if you have different ideas, please do put them in the chat. So these are examples of activities that I do in my writing group. So we know that therapy, we can use writing exercises in all kinds of groups, periodically as part of the structure and the format, and I certainly do. And we know in individual therapy, writing can be extremely therapeutic as homework assignments. In grief, writing a letter to your loved one is very common and profoundly powerful. Sometimes it takes time before someone is ready to do that. And another exercise I often give is to invite the person to write a letter to themselves from their loved one. A client can read it to the therapist. A client can talk about the process of writing, or a client can burn or destroy the writing. That can be very powerful too, to put it into the fire. Share it with a recipient, a family member, for example. And the therapist can encourage sharing with others as well. But now I want to really talk about the writing through loss groups that I offer. So I'm going to go through this rather quickly. I've been doing writing through loss groups for about 12 years. I've offered them to a large number of different communities, but mostly bereaved people, hospice and hospital staff and volunteers, etc. So these are 8-week-long groups. They are 1.5 hours, 90 minutes, and they're for adults only. We offer them 3 times a year at Mission Hospice. And the group usually contains 5 to 14 participants. Of course, since the pandemic, everything is on Zoom, and it does work well. It's facilitated with my wonderful, outstanding volunteer, Adelaide Nye, who is listening right now. And I emphasize in the very beginning, this is not a talking group. We're not going to sit around and talk about our grief. We focus on the writing and the listening to the writing. So this is an example from one of my clients who wrote a poem. Back at the Grief Writers Group, I have missed this community so much, to be someplace where it is known that I have lost my mom. If we are all going through this together, then we are not alone. I am not alone with my grief. And I like this because you can tell you don't have to be a literary artist. You don't have to use fancy words and vocabulary and, metaphor. Pure, simple honesty is so powerful and touching in this group. When should people join? I generally ask people to wait at least 2 months since the death of their loved one before joining. And Robert Niemeyer showed this in his publication, that writing is more appropriate after the acute phase of grief. But as a facilitator, I trust the client to know for themselves when they are ready. So I might have somebody 1 month out who says, I'm a retired journalist, I write for a living, this is how I cope, and I need to join. And so I will invite them to join if they're really ready for it. How long should participants write? We do 10 minutes. That's all it takes, 10 minutes. And then for homework, I invite them to write 10 to 60 minutes to contain it again, as I said, to not write for hours because that can get exhausting. And I invite them to create a routine and habit for this practice. So please do not write right before you go to bed, right before you fall asleep, because it will open up many feelings and it might make it hard to fall asleep. And we follow the 4 essential writing affirmations from an organization called Amherst Writers and Artists, AWA, by Pat Schneider, who really did sort of help to explode the interest in writing groups in the last 40, 50 years. She says, everyone has a strong, unique voice. Everyone is born with creative genius. And writing is an art form that belongs to all people, regardless of economic class or education level. And that is especially important. People do not need to write in proper English. They just need to express themselves in their true way. And also finally, a writer is someone who writes. So the structure that I have is that every curriculum is 8 weeks long and we follow a metaphorical arc. I have 12 different curricula, from taken to given, from brokenness to wholeness, from chaos to calm. So that metaphor of, intense pain, of grief to healing. And so over the first few sessions, we are the hardest. We talk about the grief, we talk about the death. I'm sorry, not talk. We write about the grief, we write about the death and the experience of grieving. And the middle session then focused more on coping, our choices, our supports, our changes, our personal death awareness, for example. And then the last maybe 2 sessions are focused on the self-empowerment, developing a new identity, new discovery, even growing in confidence and future goals. And it's just a metaphor because of course we know grief takes more than 8 weeks, but people can follow kind of some movement in this course. And each session is started with a body-focused meditation, thanks to Adelaide, to bring us into our bodies and connect our heads to our bodies and how the grief is living in our bodies. We start with an opening reading, a brief check-in, verbal check-in. How are you to this week? We have a brief grief education topic, like anniversaries or like disenfranchised loss, coping with multiple losses, etc. We start with reading the homework that people have written, with the group responding to each person. And then we write in the group for 10 minutes. And then we come back together and we read from the writing with responses from other people. And finally, we close the reading. We close with a reading and then offer the homework prompts. So as you can imagine, in 90 minutes, this is a constant, consistent movement, a structured kind of group where we move forward and are always looking at the clock. And this structure was kind of guided or informed by a curriculum called Our Griefs to Sing, that Veronica Patterson and Nancy Jacobson kindly shared with me from Pathways Hospice in Colorado. So my role is to keep the structure moving. And also we know, Dr. Pennebaker knows, that writing can increase emotional pain in the short term. We're writing about really painful experiences. And in the group, as well as during the homework writing, it can really sometimes, I don't want to say traumatize. In some cases, we have to be careful of that, but it can really upset people and dysregulate them. So my role is to pause, stop, help them to re-regulate. If I need to take them out of the room and help them kind of calm down or reconnect to themselves. My role is to allow tears, and most importantly, allow silence. If we just need to let the words hang in the air and absorb them quietly, we need to allow that space. And to allow anger. Sometimes our writing is full of profanity and F words, and that is important to express. To be flexible, to let writers write what they need to write about. Sometimes people lose someone they love, but then they say, right now I really need to write about my mother who died when I was 20. And that's just as important. I acknowledge vulnerability, courage just to sign up for this group, and belonging. We're all in this together. And my role is to recognize rumination when somebody is in a loop in their story going around and around, to ask questions for them to ponder a change in the way they're looking at something. And I do this privately. And so I already talked about this. The prompts focus on grief, reviewing the relationship, and giving voice to the person who died. That's really important. What did they want to say? How did they want to share their story? Documenting the life of the person who died. And then, as I said, you know, the emerging self. Who am I now? What are my hopes and dreams for the future? When we were in person, one part of the group I loved was using sensory prompts, pieces of clay, bottles of scents. Even the scent or the smell of a laundry detergent can really evoke memories. Listening to music or sharing pictures or videos were really powerful prompts. So I'd like to share with permission 2 of these short but powerful poems from one of my members. Grief, tears dammed up flow. Neck and shoulders sag down. 2 years have passed. And blood moon, let go. Dive into the pool of pain. Touch bottom and come up again. So very sweet, but very short, but very profound words can create such power. And opening up to others is really the power of these groups. Being able to write, read, and talk about grief openly and honestly, and most importantly, be heard and understood is what provides that safe container. So the sharing in the group is really the magic. It is a kind of, again, we have to contain the sharing. Only people who want to share can share. And some people take 4 or 5 weeks to feel comfortable sharing. And because other people are sharing, that really kind of cultivates the courage for people to share. And I use this phrase, what's shareable is bearable. We ask for something called holy listening, to put down everything else, all other personal thoughts and pain, and focus on the words being said out loud by another person. That is the holy listening activity. Anyone can pass. I also want to say that when someone reads out loud their writing, something that they wrote quickly and sort of more casually in 10 minutes, when they actually say it out loud, that's when the tears come, because they're hearing themselves speak and say the truth, their own truth. And then depending on time, you know, one person can read and a few people give feedback, or sometimes we run out of time. So everyone reads, whoever wants to read around the table, and there is no feedback, there's just listening. As I said, we focus on 3 things to listen to. What did they like about the writing? What was strong about the writing? And what stood out? So these are really only positive responses. This is not a group of criticism or trying to improve the craft of writing. And if somebody reads something very powerful about the death of their mother, sometimes the listeners may have the instinct to then say, oh, I relate to that story when my mother died, da, 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 da. And so we really have strict rules to refrain from doing that. We want people to listen to the story being shared and later talk about shared experiences, but not necessarily in response to the reading. So examples of prompts, everything in life is a prompt, are prompts to offer reflection. I used to be blank and now I'm blank. Or what does the word strong mean to you? We're always told when we're grieving, oh, you're so strong. Contrasts, I remember, I don't remember. I love, I hate, I can, I cannot. Those are contrast prompts. Completing a sentence, I deserve, I am becoming. That can be very powerful. Poetry, describe your grief in haiku. Memory, tell us a funny story of your person. Correspondence, write a letter, as I mentioned, but this time, write a letter to cancer. Write a letter to your spouse who is not supporting your grief, for example. And then finally, I do invite people to write about the death itself, what they saw, what happened, and contain it into 3 segments, 3 days before, 2 days before, the day of, or sort of contain it in certain ways, and only if they're ready to do so. And sometimes they want to share it separately from the group. So as I get towards the end of the talk, I did get permission from another client to share her writing, Sweet Dreams. So I would like to read it to you. I'm sorry, it's challenging for people who are not English readers to read this. How can suicide be sweet when it tastes so bitter? What chemical reaction could change such an event so that it could be swallowed with pleasure, or at least acceptance? I recall Maya Angelou and her first story, Why the Caged Bird Sings. I think of a Chinese nightingale and how such a beautiful bird stops singing when the door of its cage is locked. And the guilt she feels, and how does Maya really escape the throes of a violent rape at 8, and the guilt she feels for the murder of her predator because she spoke his name. She is mute now, but unable to read and write. That is what ultimately saves our heroine. And it is that and the love of others, family and friends. And it is the writing and telling of my sister, Wendy's story, that will ultimately set my family and me free. Just as Maya helped us, we can now help so many others. So we make the group, there are exercises to help the group bond. We select a title at the end of the last session, at the end of the 8th group. People come together and think of a title that expresses a theme, for seasons of change, from wrenching to wonder, bridges over troubled water, women reflecting light. In this particular group, there were only women, but most of our groups, we have a number of men and women. So this kind of makes it fun. And then we also, at least when we were in person, I would write on a sheet of paper in this group I, ... and pass it around where every person writes one line. And then we come up with a group poem. So these are just a few comments from participants. Some have said this group has been the most beneficial of all forms of support. My husband's death irrevocably altered the course of my life. Learning to write about him and our time together irrevocably altered my course of grief. And so one person even said, I was lost when I first came. Now I'm beginning to find myself. These groups are so important and needed. They're truly life-saving. So these are just comments to demonstrate how powerful a writing group can be. So in some, stories teach us about the human condition of loss. We know that. There's so many powerful and amazing books written about death and grief. And those are the ones that I'm drawn to, but those are the ones that teach us how to keep going. Stories help us know who we are and what we're capable of. Expressive writing is good for our health. Writing in grief can facilitate the grief process. Writing through grief leaves the writer with stories to mark this chapter of their lives, to document this grief and death as one chapter of their lives, and look back to see how far they've come. And finally, writing through loss groups create community. So we know there's so many books, as I said, by clinicians, including Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. So my final slide is really writing can be used as self-care for professionals, as a wonderful outlet. And one of my dear colleagues was a poet and a writer. And he wrote this reading here, which I'm not going to spend the time to read, but it is also just writing down memories of what our eyes have seen as professionals and caregivers that most people have not. And to, again, externalize the experience of being a healthcare provider onto paper. So thank you for listening. I know I talked a lot.
David,
we got somebody
David.
speaking. Just to close the loop, I'm going to share one final quote from Marianne O'Hare. Every writer I know has two selves, one who records what is happening as the other experiences that it knows that it will one day write about it. Even in the worst hours of grieving my daughter's death, a part of me knew that I would be striking matches and discovering what the light revealed. So may writing continue, or may writing become a helpful practice for you to reveal the light inside of you. So thank you so much for listening. And I'm open and happy to answer questions or invite a discussion and conversation. Thank you. Are there any questions? Let's see, there's a lot going on in the chat.
Yes, there are. So I will go through them and read them out to you, okay. And then that way we can manage it a little bit easier.
Yep.
So the first question we have on the chat is from Chris, and it's a comment that is an open question, that acute stress could interfere in the process of reaching flow, and could you speak to that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chris. Absolutely. I mean, this is why we have such grounding exercises in our writing group. This is why we encourage people to be a bit further out in their grief process. And sadly, there are eligibility criteria to run a group like this, because we need people to be in a place in their lives where they are able not only to tolerate sitting down and writing, but also tolerate listening to stories of other people's suffering. So if somebody is in a acute grief or acute stress crisis, or if their lives are too volatile, it's probably not appropriate to have somebody join a group. But certainly it is appropriate to invite writing privately, as well as in context with private psychotherapy. So sometimes it might just take words. We all know that when we're in acute crisis, we cannot even think straight in our minds. So as you know, Viktor Frankl, with his incredible suffering, I believe he did not come out with his writing. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of the other, the author of Night, whose name is escaping, but he did. Thank you, Elie Wiesel did not write for 10 years after surviving the Holocaust. So sometimes we need to write after life has calmed down, after there's a little more equilibrium, and then we are not in survival mode, but more in a reflective place in our lives.
Thank you. So we have a question from Constanza, and she asked, could we write letters to someone who's already transcended, or somebody who's already died?
Absolutely, Constanza, thank you. We know continuing bonds is a very important part of the grief experience. And absolutely, we continue our relationship with the person who died, and we can write letters to them. One of my earliest mentors in grief, as I shared my personal story, I have known many peers who have died of my illness, and I have befriended many of their parents. When I was a young adult, they were the teachers to lead me into this career. And one of them wrote to her daughter every day. And she had a journal where if she went to a concert or, a movie, she would paste the ticket stub into the journal, where she would draw a picture of where she went. So it was a creative journal with writing and art. And I was moved by that. She was writing to her daughter, even though she intellectually and emotionally knew her daughter was dead, she was continuing that relationship.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Question from Elizabeth. Would you repeat the name of the Stanford professor, please?
Yes, Dr. Audrey Schaefer. I'll see if I could write it in the chat too. She used to lead the narrative medicine program, and also has some very good books about writing for professionals, basically. Writing, especially for medical professionals, but for all healthcare professionals, how therapeutic and how important it is and life-saving it is for us to express our experience. Okay.
Thank you. Rana asks, feelings are expressed through writing stories impromptu, but when the patient is in such a condition unable to write oneself, would there be any other way of another helping hand to jot down the stories or other thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we see this in hospice at the end of life when somebody is too sick, physically sick, to hold up a pen or be on the computer. And so dictation is a form of very helpful storytelling. And what is it called? Oh goodness, my brain is not working. Life review. Thank you. Dignity therapy. Thank you so much. Dignity therapy is that form where when a patient tells their life story as somebody is writing it out and then reviews that document with the patient. But I think the question is more about being in an emotional space for writing. And I think some of the personal therapeutic benefits may be different. I don't know. I'm guessing if you verbally tell your story and someone else writes it out, then sort of the James Pennebaker model of writing for health. But I think it's still expressive. It's still narrative to get one's stories outside of oneself. And again, we know that when someone is acutely grieving or even traumatized, sometimes they're at such a state where they cannot even come up with a coherent story. And you've all seen clients probably whose stories are all over the place and chaotic, and they cannot really say what's going on. And for those people, I think that writing is something for later. They're not ready for it. If they're really needing that sort of grounding and basic survival needs being met, and then narrating what happened at a later time when they're able to be more in their heads and hearts. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question from Prana. Does the writing through the journey of grieving heal total pain, especially mental agony and depression?
I wish I could say yes. I wish it was that kind of a special antidote, but we all know that grief is a process, that the pain never really goes away. We experience it in different levels of intensity. I will say that from my experience in my writing group and my own, it does decrease. It does decrease. The more we write, the more we put down the words to describe our sorrow and our pain. Recently when I had my eye surgery, I actually lost my eye. So I'm grieving that loss. And 3 days after surgery, I started to write and cry and write and cry. And it was a way of just doing what I preach, right? To again, re-enter that world of letting those emotions out through writing. And so I do believe that it helped me move to this place where I am now of acceptance. But is it an absolute, does it end your grief and pain? No, I don't think we ever terminate these emotions. They come up in other ways. And we've talked about that in this group.
Yeah, that is a very important and valuable aspect of grieving, that it is a journey and that, we evolve with it, but we're not going to get rid of it.
No.
Yeah. Thank
I
you.
wish, but it's again, I think the key about narrative therapy is we write down our stories, we write down our suffering, and we make it a part of our life story as a way to kind of review back and say, wow, I got through that. Wow, I'm still here. I'm still breathing. That's, I think, the healing part that makes the pain of loss better and easier.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Alexandra asks how to separate this continuing repeating of the story from the victim causing the healing one's perspective. I think she's talking about, you know, from rumination and into the process that is actually going to heal the perspective.
I mean, in a clinical setting, sitting in front of a client after listening to those stories over and over as a clinician, I think sometimes, you know, let's face it, we have countertransference. We might think, oh gosh, here we go again. I've heard this before. We might feel that way, but at some point it might be worthwhile to ask the client, you know, I've heard this story and I've noticed you've told it a number of times. And what do you think is helping you? What is this doing for you? And asking them to notice, because sometimes perhaps the pain is so great they may not notice, but to really invite that reflection and that introspection about what is it, how is the telling of the story over and over again serving them? And are the parts of the story that are particularly painful that can be seen in a different way? And there's, you know, of course, in grief, we see lots of anger directed towards a healthcare provider or to someone who didn't do something right. And the truth is, I think sometimes that is just part of grief. And that has to be told, it has to be repeated until the person can find their own way to recognize that that anger has its place, but then ultimately holding on to it is more harmful than good.
Thank you. So Alexandra, who is in the Ukraine, I believe, is asking, what would be your recommendation for using grief writing, considering the situation in Ukraine, because it's not about a loss that has happened and ended, but the constant terror and fear of losing. We can't speak now about the 2 months passing from the loss because it's continually sort of suspended.
Yes, right. If someone is ready or able to write, I think lowering expectations, you know, thinking, oh, I have to write a whole narrative story is probably not reasonable. Depending on what is going on for the person, do they have some level of safety or security? That sounds like a crazy question because, of course, there is war going on. But even jotting down what they see, what they hear, what they feel, what they smell, the sensory experiences can be the very beginning of kind of being in the moment, a mindfulness practice in a time of great fear and war. Knowing that the processing and the emotional kind of perspective taking may or may not come out yet. Everyone is different. But I do think it can be a very powerful, well, it's an act of empowerment to be able to document and record the experience that someone is going through in the present moment. Knowing that, you know, it's really hard to do that in survival mode. I would commend people who are able to, and with our online world, people are doing that. They're writing their blogs and their posts in real time. So we get to see that. And I think that can be very therapeutic in itself. So I'm not fully answering that question because part of me feels that if people are in crisis, they need to focus on survival, but that in that crisis, like Anne Frank, you know, documenting what is happening in the moment, again, is a record of survival and resilience.
Thank you. So there are 2 questions from Michelle. One is, how would you suggest we use this route of writing for expressing grief for people who may be illiterate, or would this work only for those who are literate? That's question one.
Okay, question one. That's such a beautiful question. Thank you. And I do think, writing is for people who can write. We do require people in our group because of the group, the group dynamics to be English speakers and English writers. So we're going to hear from some amazing speakers in the next, what is it, 7 weeks or so. I forget the number of sessions, but that I think their art may be a better form for people who are illiterate to express themselves. Writing is an art form for people who are able to write and read. Yeah.
Thank you. The second question is, what are some online sources or support groups that are available for one to join?
For writing, goodness. I wish I knew. You can look at the Amherst Writers and Artists website, and they offer groups, but they're not necessarily grief groups. So our groups at Mission Hospice require you to live in our geographic area, and so there are restrictions. Just because having a group of 300 people is not effective in a writing group, because the sharing is what's so important. And we don't want introverts to be kicked out or not be able to share or read. We want to invite everyone. That sometimes happens in much larger groups. So I wish I had other examples. Thank you. Hope Edelman and Refuge in Grief have online groups. If you can find their links, if anyone's interested. Thank you so much, Elisabeth, for sharing that.
Okay, so we are coming to nearing the time where we must close, but here's a question from Chris. How is defined a loss that is to be grieved? For example, I don't have children, I would like to have them, but no regrets. I am starting menopause.
Mm-hmm.
Is this a not told story? How can I know it?
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, who was the person who shared that? Chris. Okay, thank you, Chris. Thank you for your honesty. I can relate to you. I think stories are stories, and stories of loss are stories, and they all deserve to be shared, and they all deserve to be told. I started my presentation talking about my journey with illness, and infertility, basically anything that is unmet expectations to me is a loss and a grief worth writing about, because there's teaching in writing. Every time you bring forth a story, other people will learn from it and relate to it. So bringing voice to the experience of not having children and reaching a point where it's too late is a story that I think needs to be told and many people could relate to. So I encourage you to write. Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
thank you so much. I mean, that question to me brings up, I think, an underlying question that maybe is there of how do I recognize when I've had a loss that is not the obvious losses that we can easily identify. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I go back to that metaphor of the pearl necklace. Writing a sort of review of one's life to look at all of the pearls, and I don't mean pearls, they don't need to be shiny and beautiful. They are stories, right? They're stories of something that happened in our life that changed us or hurt us or impacted us in some more profound way. And all of that is important. All of that beaded together becomes the story of your life. And so it could be something like, a father going off to war. It could be something like, you know, a mom having a miscarriage, or, you know, being bullied at school, and all of those difficulties. They're not death losses, but they're different kinds of grief. They are worth telling and worth sharing. And at the end of the day, you know, the string of the pearl necklace is ultimately what came of that. What did you learn from all of those experiences about yourself? And what are you carrying inside of yourself right now, right here in your life after living through all of that? Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. I think that's a perfect way to bring this to an arbitrary close. And so I want to thank you. There's many wonderful comments in the chat about the value and the meaning and how they've been touched with your sharing today. And I hope we're all inspired to explore our journey with grief, with writing, and whatever forms storytelling can take place through our journey.
Thank you. And I'm going to hang out here for a little bit if anybody has additional questions, if that's okay, Wilka, unless you have to go.
Oh yeah, we have to go.
We have to go. Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Sorry about that. But if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to share prompts and other ideas. Feel free to reach out to me through you or the email address that I put up on the slide. I didn't have a lot of time for a lot of engagement, but I'm so honored and happy to be here. Writing is my passion, and I do hope that some of you personally will dive in, and maybe you already have, but I hope that you can share your stories going forward and encourage your clients to do the same. So thank you so much, Wilka, and everyone else, our translators. I hope I wasn't speaking too quickly, but I applaud your talent and gifts to help everybody else understand the stories I'm telling. So yes. See you next week.
Thank you. See you next week.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.